The morning I decided to stop writing checks for people who had stopped counting my daughter, I was standing at the stove making blueberry pancakes. Not because I'd planned anything. Not because I'd rehearsed a speech or consulted a lawyer or spent a week steeling myself. I was just standing there with a spatula in my hand, thinking about a photograph I'd seen the night before on my phone, and something in me went very still and very certain in the same breath. My name is Nora. I'm 33, married to a man named Patrick, and we have one daughter, Cleo, who turned 5 in October. We live in a 2-story rental in Columbus, Ohio, while we save for something of our own. Patrick is a civil engineer. I'm a licensed veterinary technician, which means I spend my days reading lab panels, adjusting medication dosages, and catching things that other people miss. I'm trained to notice what's wrong before anyone names it. You'd think I would have applied that skill at home sooner. Cleo's 5th birthday was a Saturday. We had the yard strung with paper lanterns, a lemon cake with a fox on it because she'd decided foxes were more sophisticated than unicorns, and the specific chaos that only exists when 14 people show up to celebrate a child who cannot yet contain her own joy. My parents, Vincent and Ruth, arrived 40 minutes late. They hugged Cleo, called her their sweetheart, and handed Patrick their coats. No bag. No card. Nothing wrapped or tucked under an arm. I noticed immediately and filed it under "We'll sort this out later," which is the folder I have been filling my entire adult life. My younger sister Diane was there with her husband and their daughter Margot, who is 8. Diane had brought Cleo a set of watercolor paints and a pad of thick paper that cost more than she should have spent. Cleo opened it and immediately painted a red oval she called a volcano. Diane caught my eye across the yard when our parents came through the door with empty hands. I gave her a very small shake of my head. Later, when the guests were gone, and Cleo was asleep in a pile of wrapping paper like something a very festive storm had deposited, Patrick and I sat at the kitchen table. He said carefully, "Your parents didn't bring her anything." I told him they'd forgotten, and that they'd make it up to her. He nodded in the way that means he's decided not to argue. I could feel everything he wasn't saying suspended in the air between us like weather. Here is the thing I should have told you before now. My parents have always divided their attention the way some people divide an estate, based on perceived need, with considerable discretion over what constitutes need. Diane's daughter Margot has slept at my parents' house dozens of times. My mother takes her to the farmer's market. My father taught her to play chess. There are photographs on their refrigerator. A whole overlapping collage of Margot at various ages, various meals, various ordinary Tuesday afternoons. Cleo appears in one photograph. It's from her christening. She's blurry. I had told myself the explanation was proximity. Diane and her family live 8 minutes from my parents. We live 35. But I knew, if I was honest, that the drive wasn't really the distance. I gave my parents 10 days. No gift arrived in the mail. No call asking for Cleo to come over so they could make it right. On the 11th day, I was sitting with my phone after Cleo was in bed, and I made the mistake of opening my mother's social media page. There was a photograph posted 2 days earlier, which I'd somehow missed. Margot was sitting at my parents' kitchen table, holding a brand new laptop, grinning. The caption said something about how smart she was, how they'd wanted to get her something that would help her learn. I stared at it long enough that Patrick came and found me sitting on the bathroom tile with my phone in both hands. He read it. He set my phone on the edge of the sink. He said, "Okay. That's the thing." And it was. That was exactly the thing. Not the laptop itself, not even the money, but the visibility of it. They had photographed their generosity toward one grandchild and posted it publicly, 11 days after forgetting the birthday of another. Have you ever had the experience of understanding something you already knew? Not learning it for the first time, but feeling it land in your body with a weight it didn't have before? That is what happened in that bathroom. I had promised my parents $12,000 toward the renovation of their back porch and sunroom. We'd discussed it in August. I had genuinely intended to send it. The following morning, I decided I had forgotten. The calls came within 48 hours. 12 the first day, 9 the second, 4 texts from my mother, that escalated in tone from questioning to wounded to something approaching accusation. I didn't respond to any of them. I wasn't angry in the way that makes you want to argue. I was something quieter than anger, something more like resolution. On the third day, my father appeared at our front door at 8 in the morning. He didn't ring the bell, he knocked hard. 3 times, the way someone knocks when they've already decided the conversation is a formality. I opened the door. He came inside without being invited and stood in our kitchen looking at the pan on the stove. Cleo was eating toast at the table. She said, "Grandpa Vince," and held up her toast like an offering. He gave her the kind of smile you give a stranger's child in a grocery store, brief and obligatory, then turned to me. He said they were counting on that money. He said they'd made plans around it. I asked him how they'd found the time to purchase a $600 laptop for Margot, while they were apparently too overwhelmed to pick up a birthday card for Cleo. He went very quiet. Cleo, who is 5 and perceptive in the way that children are when adults underestimate them, climbed down from her chair and went to the living room without being asked. Patrick came downstairs. My father looked at him and said, "Talk some sense into her." Patrick poured himself coffee, took one slow sip and said, "I think she's making sense." My father left and the door swung shut behind him harder than it needed to. I felt terrible. I want to be precise about this. Standing up for yourself, when you have spent 33 years not doing it, feels identical to doing something wrong. My hands were shaking. I sat at the table for a long time. Patrick sat across from me. He said, "You didn't kick anyone. You just stopped absorbing it." That afternoon, Diane called. My mother had reached out to her, upset, describing me as someone who had broken a promise over nothing. I told Diane the whole sequence, the birthday, the laptop photograph, the unanswered calls, my father's visit. She listened without speaking, which is unusual for Diane, who has detailed opinions about nearly everything, including the correct direction to hang a roll of toilet paper. When I finished, she said quietly that she hadn't realized they hadn't brought Cleo anything at the party. She said she hadn't known about the laptop until Margot came home with it. I believed her. Diane has never been anything but fair to Cleo. She is the one who always brings an extra small gift, who always includes Cleo in Margot's celebrations. She has been the counterweight our whole lives. That evening, a text arrived from my mother. She and my father had decided that since the renovation funds were apparently unavailable, they were going to use their emergency savings to take a trip with Diane's family, a long weekend at a lake house. Everyone was invited, the message said, meaning everyone except Patrick, Cleo, and me. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. The money they had told me they urgently needed, the money they'd said was the difference between finishing the project this year and leaving it half done, apparently existed in a form transferable to a vacation for 5 people at a lake house. I sent back a single word: wonderful. I didn't send anything else. But Diane called me that same night. She said she wasn't going. I told her she should go, that Margot would love it, that it wasn't her problem to solve. She said, "Nora, Cleo is my niece." I'm not being used to make a point. She refused to argue about it. I cried. Not because of my parents, but because of her. Because sometimes the thing that finally breaks you open is not the harm but the hand reaching in from the other side of it. My parents went to the lake house alone. They were gone 4 days. During those 4 days, I did not call them, and I did not feel guilty, which was new. When they returned, my mother called Diane. She asked, in Diane's retelling, whether they had genuinely gotten things so wrong. Diane said yes. Apparently my mother cried, not the strategic crying she sometimes deployed in arguments, but something older and more frightened, the sound of someone realizing they might have damaged something they actually valued. She told Diane they had always seen her family as the one that needed more, single income, tighter margins, harder circumstances, and that somewhere along the way helping more had become in their minds the same thing as meaning more. My father took longer. He is not someone who moves toward difficult things. He marches around them in increasingly smaller circles until he eventually arrives. 3 weeks after the lake house, he showed up on a Saturday morning at a reasonable hour and rang the bell. He was holding a small paper bag. Inside was a stuffed fox, orange with a white belly. Exactly the kind of thing a 5-year-old who has recently decided foxes are sophisticated would love. He said he didn't know how to explain it. He said he thought they'd been making decisions without seeing what the decisions looked like from where Cleo stood. He didn't ask for the money back. He didn't make it about the renovation. He just said he wanted to try to do better, and he said it standing on my porch with his hands at his sides, which for my father is the equivalent of getting on his knees. I let him in. Cleo came around the corner, took one look at the fox, and claimed it immediately. My father sat on our living room floor and helped her name it. They decided on Captain. He stayed for lunch. Things are not fixed. They are in the process of being fixed, which is a different and slower thing. My mother has started scheduling time with Cleo that belongs only to Cleo, not folded into something else, not incidental to another visit. My father has been teaching her to identify birds from the window feeder he bought and set up in our backyard. The renovation money we kept. It's in an account we opened for Cleo's education. My parents haven't mentioned it. I think they understand without it being said that the money was never actually the subject. Some costs don't come with invoices. They accumulate in small overlooked moments, in blurry photographs pushed to the back of albums, in children who stop expecting things because the absence has become ordinary. The reckoning arrives only when someone finally names the total. Have you ever done the quiet math of what you've been absorbing without accounting for it? And if you have, what did you do once you saw the number clearly?